let's talk about inflation and why the numbers aren't really what they seem. And you're not crazy for thinking things are getting much more expensive than we're being told to believe. So the inflation numbers that are usually used is the CPI metric, which basically measures a basket of different goods and services to come up with a number for what inflation is. Then the Federal Reserve then uses that CPI metric to guide monetary policy. So it takes a combination of all these categories, but again, these are very cherry-picked items when you take a look at it. So the biggest thing for me is the housing calculation. So you think to calculate inflation of housing, you would take real rents and the price to purchase a home into account to see how bad inflation really is. But they don't actually use housing prices. What they do is a combination between rents, so actual rent data, and the other half of it is they just do a survey of homeowners who don't actually rent out their homes and just ask them what they would estimate they would rent their house for if they had to. So the biggest thing that CPI inflation doesn't measure is the cost of assets. And because we have this inflationary currency that is really backed by nothing, is printed out of thin air, especially in times of distress, insane amounts of money are printed, asset prices massively inflate, right? Because the money itself fails as a store of value. So you need these assets to be able to park and maintain your value over time. So that's why I like to call CPI, which I saw this in a book, but the cherry pick basket. It doesn't include everything you want. It's constantly adjusted, and it's not your life. Inflation is different for everyone. This doesn't actually measure what you want to buy. It just measures an average of some goods and services to guide monetary policy. And I would argue, there's arguments to both sides, but I would argue that it's a very manipulated metric to make inflation look not as bad as it truly is, as you would experience. And I think the home price is a good indicator of that, right? Everyone wants to own a home. That's becoming massively more unaffordable for my generation, but that's not taken into account with these inflation numbers. So even if you see a metric, right, a financial metric from the past that says like adjusted for inflation, they're using CPI inflation. They're not using asset inflation. So like I said, your inflation depends on your life, rent, housing costs, healthcare, education, family costs, assets, homes and stocks. That's why it feels higher than the CPI metric. There's no single inflation number. It's different for everyone. It depends on what you want to buy. And the Cantillon Effect is a great explainer for why inflation is different for everyone. The Cantillon Effect explains that the closer you are to the source of money creation, the more you benefit. So the ultra wealthy benefit the most from money creation, right? They're closest to the money printer, right? When new currency gets created, it first goes to the banks and the financial institution and, kind of trickles down from there. And the last person to get this new flow of money is the person that's a wage earner, right? They experience inflation the worst because asset prices have already inflated and the wage is the last thing to move in the chain. So money printing goes to banks, institutions, and asset holders. Those asset prices rise first and wages lag way behind everything else. And then again, like I said, in 2020 and other world events, you have massive monetary expansion outside of the normal, 2 to 3% CPI. So with 2020, the supply of money, the overall supply of money expanded 20%. Right? We don't have an exact number on how many dollars are in circulation, but this can be estimated through M1 and M2 money supply. But the CPI inflation isn't going to reflect this massive expansion of the money supply. This has more long-term effects and shows up much later. So the biggest thing here to understand is that money is losing accuracy as a measure of value, right? Money should be a way to measure economic value. How valuable is something, right? How much financial energy would one have to exchange to acquire something? So picture a ruler, right? You have a ruler, you use this ruler to measure everything, right? That ruler just shrinks, 3% or 2 to 3% or more, like we discussed. But it still says 12 inches on it, right? So this is why so many people get caught up in this when it's like such a simple phenomenon as to why things are getting more expensive, right? I'm measuring my car. So today it's 10 feet. A few years from now, it's 13 feet, right? How did that happen? Right? The ruler just got smaller, but you're measuring the same thing and you're like, oh my God, my car got so much bigger. How did that happen? Right? It's because the measuring stick is shrinking. It still says 1 foot, but it takes more feet to get a car now. Like, why is that the case? Most people never ask themselves why this is the case. They just blame things getting expensive on one specific corporation, on, one specific person, politician, whatever it is. That's not the reason things are getting more expensive. Things are getting more expensive because the thing we're using to measure economic value is shrinking, but the unit is staying the same. That's why inflation is such a hidden tax, because you don't notice it because the dollar amount in your bank account doesn't get taken away from you, but it just buys less and less every year. And when you can convince the population that things are getting expensive because of that guy over there, it's his fault, then it's a lot easier to justify massive expansion of the money supply to fund frivolous spending. So that's about it for this video. That's why inflation is as bad as we think it is, right? So my name's Josh. I make daily videos here on YouTube. If you want to support, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. That really helps out a ton. And I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.